It's happening. Yeah.
It's Josephine.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, hey, welcome everybody. Great to see you all. Thanks for coming. People will keep streaming in, which is totally fine. Get some pizza, get some CACR swag out there if you haven't already too. Okay, we're trying to clear out that closet. So this is the last CACR speaker series for the term already, which is crazy, but we're ending on a very, very high note with Josephine here today. So if you're unfamiliar, Professor Wolff, Associate Professor of Cybersecurity Policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts. Her research interests include a wide range of different topics, including, as we'll hear, cybersecurity incidents, internet governance, cyber insurance. She's written a range of just stellar books, including in You'll See This Message When It's Too Late, the legal and economic aftermath of cybersecurity breaches, which is just terrific. Her writing on cybersecurity has also appeared in Slate, little-known publications like the New York Times and Washington Post and The Atlantic, as well as Wired. And today, fantastic title, I love it. We're going to be hearing about lessons lost, how lawyers undermine cybersecurity investigations. It's about time you call us out, Josephine. So thanks so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be here. I've never been to Indiana before, but it's a university that looms extremely large in my field as the place that does really the most kind of effective and interesting and important interdisciplinary cybersecurity work across people in computer science, people in law, people in business, people in political science. So it's a tremendous honor to be here. And I always, when I go to law schools, which I seem to be in today, like to talk about the research I've done that has upset the most lawyers. And so the project I'm going to talk about today is really trying to understand how lawyers have influenced the direction of cybersecurity investigations. And this is a project I came to not because I hate lawyers, not because I wanted to sort of look at this question originally, but because of a lot of my interests that sort of come out of my earlier research. And so I want to talk a little bit about the motivation for this project before I get into the project itself. Part of that motivation comes from my first book project about the aftermath of cybersecurity incidents, because one of the things that I really believe and I really enjoy working on is this question of what can we learn from past cybersecurity incidents. And I think there's sometimes a trope in cybersecurity around this idea of the only thing that matters is what's going to happen next, right? We shouldn't be worrying about yesterday's cyber attacks. They're already outdated. We've already protected ourselves against them. We should be worrying about the next 0 day, the next attack, the next novel vector somebody comes up with. And I think while it is true that sometimes we see brand new 0 days, brand new attack vectors, much more often, we see people recycling old vulnerabilities, old attack methods that we haven't actually patched effectively, and we haven't learned the lessons we should have from the past year or the past 5 years, or in some cases, the past 10 years of incidents. So one of the first motivations for sort of thinking about this project is trying to understand why it's important to learn from past cybersecurity incidents, and so that you don't just have to take my word for it. I pulled some quotations from more reputable sources. This is a NIST report saying one of the most important parts of incident response, learning and improving, right? When we do incident response for cybersecurity breaches or attacks, we want to learn from them. We want to sort of understand what we can take away from that to protect against this type of incident in the future. ENISA, the European Cybersecurity Agency, has also talked about this idea that insurers, which is another area that I study a lot, want to accumulate data when they collect claims about cybersecurity incidents that they can use to mine and improve risk assessment and suggest best practice mitigation strategies to their clients. So this is one of the early ideas around cyber insurance that gets me interested in that field, is less the question of sort of how does insurance work, which is something I come to much later, but more this idea of insurers collect all this claims data when they pay out for cybersecurity incidents. Can we learn something from that data? Can we look across thousands of cybersecurity incidents, many of which are not going to be reported publicly, because the only types of incidents that historically have really needed or been required to be reported publicly in this country are incidents that involve the breach of personal data, which means we don't have a lot of consistent data on ransomware. We don't have a lot of consistent data on denial of service attacks, things like that. And the idea, one of the reasons I got excited about cyber insurance so many years ago was exactly this notion that insurers were going to have access to all this data because companies were going to tell them about these incidents in order to get claims paid out. And then we'd be able to use that data, or the insurers would be able to use that data to say something about which of the various security controls and services and countermeasures are most effective, right? So there's a sort of individual learning. We're doing incident response for this incident. We want to learn something from it. There's also this aggregate data collection idea. We're going to collect information about 100,000 incidents and figure out what type of encryption works best, or which of these multi-factor authentication systems seem to have vulnerabilities that we need to think about patching. And then this is a report from a few years ago out of the Belfer Center at Harvard, talking about this idea that one of the things the IT industry does not do well is it doesn't have strong processes for extracting lessons learned and publishing them when incidents occur. And I think there are a lot of factors that play into that we have some awareness of. A big one is, again, going to be sort of the confidentiality around cybersecurity incidents. If you get breached, you want to tell everybody as little about that as possible, right? That's bad publicity for you. That's going to upset your shareholders or your customers or whoever else. You certainly don't want to tell people a lot about it if what you've learned is that the way you were doing security was inadequate or deficient in some manner. And so in general, this has been, I would say, a challenge across the board. And I come to this project as a kind of combination of being interested in the question of how do we do a better job of learning from incidents? How do we gather and mine and understand some of this data in a better way? And also because I'm super interested in this insurance industry. This is the book I wrote a couple of years ago about cyber insurance. And one of the things that really puzzled me when I did this project, and I write a lot in the book about sort of the failure of the insurance industry to do that large scale data analysis and tell us, look, here are the things that really work for cybersecurity. And they do it really well in some other fields, right? When we think about the ways that the insurance industry has contributed to our understanding of auto safety and what helps there, right? It is the thing insurance can sometimes do. It doesn't happen, or it hasn't happened yet, around cyber insurance. And one of the reasons that I suggested sort of in the interviews I do with insurers that they're struggling with this, and really kind of shocked me as I was doing these interviews, is that people kept saying to me things like what this underwriter said: I get data on the causes and security controls associated with fewer than 5% of the incidents that we pay out claims for. So I was talking to insurers for years and years, and several of them said to me, look, how am I supposed to do data analysis when somebody files a claim with my insurance carrier and all I know is there was a ransomware incident and we paid out $50,000 and I don't know what kind of security measures they had in place, and I don't know what worked and I don't know what went wrong. I can't do any large-scale data analysis on what's working and what's not working. And so this project that I'm going to talk about today is kind of trying to answer the question of what's going on here, right? The insurers write the checks. Shouldn't they be able to demand as much information as they want about what it is they're covering? Why aren't they demanding that? And one of the things that we heard over and over again, sort of from insurers in an informal and sometimes fairly disgruntled way, was, well, it's all these lawyers, right? The lawyers won't tell us anything. They keep sort of threatening us that if they tell us something about an incident, then it's going to have to be turned over to plaintiffs and there's going to be a big class action lawsuit. And we as the insurer are going to have to pay all of those legal costs because we also cover the liability for a lot of these companies. And so that's how I got interested in the questions that sort of underpin this project, is first of all, trying to understand where do lawyers fit into this process? And second of all, what is it that they're sort of doing that's perhaps a hindrance, or at least in the eyes of some of these insurers, a hindrance to collecting better data. And I just, for those of you who haven't sort of done a lot of work around cybersecurity incidents before, I want to give you a very sort of simplified picture of what happens when there is a cybersecurity incident. And I'm including basically everything. I'm including data breaches, I'm including ransomware, I'm including any kind of sort of system outage, any potential espionage. If you work at an organization and there's a sense something's gone wrong, either we've discovered it or somebody else has notified us. If you have cyber insurance, which not all firms do, you call your insurer and you typically say, you know, look, there's a ransomware attack, there's been some kind of data breach. What do I do? And you do that first because you want to make sure that whatever you do next, it's not going to jeopardize your ability to get a claim paid out. And one of the things that's happened over the course of the past 5 to 10 years is that pretty much the next step is always going to be the insurer saying to their policyholder, you need to talk to one of the law firms on our panel. And in some cases, this was not the norm, but we did hear this from a couple of the insurers we talked to. Actually, the phone number that the insurers give to their policyholders just goes directly to a breach law firm. So there you cut the insurer out of that process entirely. But even if they are in the mix, very, very much across the board, the next thing that's going to happen in 2021, 2022, 2023 is you're going to be referred to a lawyer And lawyers are then going to oversee the incident investigation and response process. And again, I want to emphasize this is going to be true pretty much regardless of the type of incident, right? It's not a sort of distinction between, oh, this is a breach of personal information, we're worried about class action, this is a ransomware attack, something different. The lawyers are going to run that whole process. And the questions that I sort of set out with some co-authors, I should say this is joint work with Daniel Schwartz at the University of Minnesota and Daniel Woods at the University of Edinburgh. The questions that we set out to try and understand are, why does this happen? And what are the impacts of it on these investigations? And I think there are a couple reasons that you sort of see this very close intermingling or relationship between the law firms and the insurance firms. A big one, I think, is just that sort of historically, there has been a lot of insurance coverage for data breaches of personal information. Because when insurance firms start offering these products in the very late 1990s, picking up some steam in the early 2000s, those are the main types of cybersecurity incidents that we know about. States have data breach notification laws, so they're in the news. Because of those notification laws, a lot of firms are worried about being sued because they have to tell people, hey, your data's been stolen. So they're concerned about the costs. They go to insurance firms, and insurers start offering these kind of data breach insurance policies. And one of the things that happens after breaches of personal information is there are a lot of class action lawsuits, right? We see that in most of the big data breaches that you've heard of, in Equifax and Target and so on. And because of that, there is often sort of a sense that the largest component of the costs that an insurer is covering here are actually going to be those legal fees and settlement costs associated with data breaches. And because that's the largest cost, that's the thing that insurers are most focused on driving down. And when they look at their claims data, what they see is this idea that if you get a lawyer involved very early on, that actually helps drive down those legal costs. And I think this is important because they don't see this about literally anything else they track, right? They don't see, oh, if you've got, really strong authentication measures, or if you hire the security services of this firm or that firm, that's going to drive down costs. They see you need a lawyer in the mix early. And so that, I think, really drives the idea of the first thing you do is you tell all of your policyholders, go talk to a lawyer, right? Get that legal advice involved early. And because so much of this is going to be about sort of trying to prepare for and protect against these class action lawsuits, the big value add that I think the insurers are seeing in this legal involvement is the idea that the lawyers can protect the confidentiality of these investigations. And there are sort of two different ways of doing this. Since I'm standing in a law school and I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to pretend to be the world expert on either of them, but I'm going to flag them for those of you who, like me, don't come from legal backgrounds. One is attorney-client privilege, right? Which is the idea that everything that's sort of either an oral or written communication between a lawyer and their client that is being done to obtain legal advice. So this is going to come back to be important. The idea that your communication has to be about preparing for some kind of litigation, providing some kind of legal advice, is going to be protected. And the other is work product doctrine, which is going to be really important for things like incident reports, right? If we go back 10 or 15 years, a lot of the big cybersecurity incidents, you have a public report coming out of a Mandiant or another firm saying, we've looked at the South Carolina Department of Revenue breach and here's everything we found. Those aren't always public, right? As for the same reason that not all cybersecurity incidents are public, but they're very reliably being written as part of the incident response process. And the idea that a lot of law firms bring to this process is that those can be protected under work product doctrine because they're helping these firms prepare for potential litigation. And because they're protected under work product doctrine, because other communications are protected under attorney-client privilege, when there is, or if there is then a big class action lawsuit, the idea is you don't have to turn over those communications or that report to the plaintiffs. And so you can do a really sort of honest assessment of what did we do wrong, what should we learn from this incident, but not be worried that that's then going to fall into the hands of the people who are suing you if they're going to use it against you and say, look, here's a report laying out every single mistake you made in your security. The research questions that underpin this project. First one is just, what are the measures that lawyers take when they get involved in these investigations to try and protect confidentiality? Right, you don't just get to the, we heard this from a lot of the digital forensics people we interviewed from this project. They're like, well, I just put confidential in the subject line of every email and then I'm good. Actually, no, turns out. So there are a whole bunch of measures that lawyers think through and apply to say, here's how we're going to make sure attorney-client privilege applies. Here's how we're going to make sure work product doctrine applies to everything that's involved in these investigations. First thing we wanted to do was just talk to a bunch of lawyers and understand, what are those measures? What does that actually mean if it's not putting, privileged and confidential in the subject line of the email? And the second part of that is trying to understand, okay, now that we know what those measures are, how are they actually impacting the digital forensics and incident response work, right? What does that mean for the kinds of technical analysis that prior to the shift towards having lawyers involved and leading all of these investigations was largely being led by these DFIR firms. DFIR firms I use as shorthand for digital forensics and incident response. It's sometimes challenging if you talk to political scientists, because IR means something very different to them. But we're interested not just in what is it lawyers are doing, but also what impact does this have on everybody else who's involved in these investigations. So we conduct 69 interviews with a mix of different types of stakeholders. The majority of them are lawyers who work on incident response and breaches. But we also talk to a lot of the digital forensics and incident response specialists to understand sort of what this looks like from their side, because they're also, of course, very intimately involved in all of these investigations. We talk to a number of insurers, because again, part of our interest in sort of understanding these dynamics is trying to trace that back to, well, what does this mean for the insurance firms and their ability to collect data? We talk to a few regulators, right? We're also curious about, if you're doing any kind of regulatory oversight in this space, how does it impact your ability to look at different types of incidents? Is the fact that people are trying to protect information here a challenge for the Department of Homeland Security or for law enforcement agencies or groups like that, the Federal Trade Commission, who might be interested in trying to understand what happened? And some of the other sort of crisis management specialists, information sharing coordinators, about their perspectives on how the kind of lawyer-run investigation influences their ability to do their jobs. And the interviews are conducted from 2020 to 2022, which is an interesting moment to be doing this project, because there are also some legal decisions coming out about the applicability of work product doctrine and attorney-client privilege to cybersecurity investigations. So as we're doing this project, a lot of the lawyers who we're talking to are saying, well, we've actually had to change a lot of our practices because courts aren't viewing the things we've been doing as sufficient to shield some of the reports that we've been overseeing. And in terms of methodology, we sort of look for law firms that are very common on insurer panels, right? We're interested in kind of who are the law firms that these insurance firms are working with over and over and over again. And same thing with digital forensics and incident response firms. We're looking at sort of who are the go-to firms that all of the insurance companies are recommending to their policyholders to understand the stakeholders who are most involved in this. Then we talk to also sort of a bunch of major law firms that have a large cybersecurity and privacy practice group to try and get a mix of larger firms, smaller firms, more expensive firms, less expensive firms, because all of that kind of plays into the question of who are insurers recommending and how beholden to those insurers are these law firms when they're thinking about what they're doing. So let's start by talking a little bit about our findings around just what is it that lawyers do when they come on the scene. What do they think is really important for protecting confidentiality? First thing they want to do is they want to hire typically a new company that is not the security company you've been working with before your incident, but a new company that's going to help investigate the incident. The idea there being, this is not somebody who you had a prior business relationship with. This is a firm that's coming in just to provide legal advice at a moment when legal advice is needed, to sort of really clarify this is all about the legal advisory role of this firm. Those are usually hired through tripartite contracts. That is, the breached firm, the forensics and incident response firm, and the law firm are all party to that contract, to again make clear this is all about kind of the legal advice coming through here. The law firms also very closely monitor all of the contact that the technical forensics people have with the breach firm. And we heard a lot of different variations on that, right? Could be we're on every single call. It could be we're on every single call where anything of any substance is being talked about. Could be we need to be CC'd on every email. But a sort of really strong sense of we want to be part of every conversation. And again, largely with the idea, first of all, we want to know what's going on and make sure nobody says anything they're not supposed to say. But also we want it to be clear this is about sort of lawyers and legal advice and not anything else where the confidentiality protections might not apply. We heard a lot of variations on the idea, especially following some of the legal rulings in 2020, that just less documentation was better. Right. And this, I think, starts to get at the question of, well, why does this make it harder to learn lessons from these incidents. We don't want to write things down, right? We can have a briefing call where we talk to the breach firm and we tell them, hey, you maybe should have done this or that. But as soon as we write that down in a report or we put that on slides, it's potentially going to be something that becomes discoverable. And the less we document, the more confident we are that nobody's ever going to be able to sort of dredge that documentation back up. And a big piece of that, something we heard over and over that really surprised me, is you never put any recommendations in writing, right? If you want to tell a firm you should really do this, you should really encrypt all your data, you should really change your authentication protocols, you never write that down. Because as soon as you've written that down, if they then don't do that, it becomes ammunition for plaintiffs to go after them and say, hey, your own security firm told you to do this and you didn't. And so you get sort of this trend towards lawyers very involved in every stage, and at every stage trying to push for don't write too much down, you know, don't create any sort of enduring documentation of what it is you're deciding. Here's a really inscrutable graph. This is where we try to be semi-quantitative, which we don't do well. But this is you can't see the top row, but here we're just sort of creating a column for every single breach attorney who we talk to in this project and documenting of these different practices who says, yes, we do this. So the black circles say, you know, yes, we absolutely discourage formal reports. The white circles say, no, we don't do that. And the half black, half white circles are like, sometimes we do this, sometimes not. It depends a little. Brilliant. Thank you. And so the first thing I'd say is that there's a certain amount of variation just across the board, but there are also things that are really consistent, right? Discouraging reports, attending the daily and regular updates, discouraging recommendations, contacting the forensics firm directly from the law firm as opposed to having the breach firm do that. Those are all things that we heard over and over again. I'm going to talk a little bit about pre-breach activities towards the end. I just want to flag that because one of the things we were really interested in is not just how do lawyers get involved after something's gone wrong, but also once they sort of establish this idea of we don't want any recommendations in writing, what does that mean if you're just doing like a standard cybersecurity audit, which typically involves a lot of recommendations, right? You should, you know, shut down this port, you should run this scan, you should do X, Y, or Z. Does that also mean that sort of there's risk there? And again, we heard, I think, some really varying answers, but the general consensus for most of the lawyers we talked to is yes, we take steps to establish the confidentiality of these pre-breach audits or assessments, but we don't actually discourage them from happening, right? Where you know, we do want people to get cybersecurity assessments. We do try to, if we can, make that something where it's perhaps not totally easy to dig up in court. Most of them, I would say, we're not confident that they could actually protect that using attorney-client privilege. And this again comes back to the idea when you're doing a pre-breach assessment, when you're just sort of like assessing the lay of the land, it's hard to make the case that's really in anticipation of litigation, right? You don't have any litigation hanging over your head at that point. You don't have a cybersecurity incident. And so I think a lot of the lawyers we talked to said, yeah, we do some of this stuff, but we don't really know that it's going to work. We don't know that it's going to hold up if somebody then tries to get access to those assessments. So I want to read you some quotes because I think this is one of the most fun things about doing interview research. Oh, yeah. Is kind of hearing the voices of the people who we talk to. These are two quotes from attorneys who we talked to, talking a little bit about their oversight of communications between the forensic investigators and the breach firms. So here's an attorney who says, we tell forensic firms that they can have direct communications with the client, but those communications are limited in scope. Logistical or simple requests don't need to go through me. But if there's ever discussion of substantive questions involving the data or vulnerabilities on the network, or talk about observations you're making, then I need to be part of those discussions. Here's another attorney who says something sort of similar. Says, look, if the consultant is trying to get logs from IT people, we don't need to be on those calls. That's just logistical planning. But once conversations about where the firewalls were set up and how things were configured begin happening, we need to be involved in those conversations, right? So it's trying to say, you know, as soon as you start talking about what the firm did well, did badly, we need to be on the line. We need to make sure there's sort of a lawyer involved, both for being able to say this was all about legal advice and for being able to monitor, you know, let's not go any further down that path. And then I'll give you a quote here from one of the forensic investigators. And part of what we were interested in was sort of how frustrating do the technical people find this legal oversight, especially given that many of them who've been in this field for a while can remember a time when lawyers weren't running all of these investigations, when they were sort of the ones who were in charge of deciding what needs to be done. And they're talking a little bit about sort of what it is they've been told by the law firms that they work with. in these investigations. One of them says, you never opine on whether the client has good or bad data security. If you get on a scoping call with a client and they don't have multi-factor authentication enabled, or their password was password with a 0, you never chastise them, you never comment, especially in writing, on how good their data security is, because if all the emails get out in discovery, then you've set up your client for failure. Right, so these ideas about sort of what it is you can say, in particular what you put in writing, are really passed on to the forensics investigators and their sense of sort of, here's what you can do, here's what is really dangerous to do for your clients. A couple more quotes from breach attorneys, these specifically about reports. The question of, at the end of this investigation, are you going to put together a full postmortem of what happened? Here's an attorney who says, look, if I know there's likely to be litigation, we don't produce a report. People will go to the mat to get the report, so it's much easier to just say, I'm sorry, we don't have one. Right? If I think there's a pretty good chance somebody's going to sue here, I don't want to have a big fight about, can we turn this over or not? I just want to be able to say, we never wrote that report. We have nothing to turn over. And here's somebody, another attorney who has a slightly different take on this, but related. The only times we do a full-fledged forensics report is if there's no personal information stolen that you need to disclose. It didn't affect anyone. Then I would say, let's get a full-fledged forensics report so that a year from now, we can make sure we learned everything and implemented everything as a result of it. Because there's no risk anyone's ever going to see it because it didn't affect anyone. Right, so a similar idea of like, look, if there's not a soul in the world who was impacted by this breach, fine, let's write everything down, let's learn everything we possibly could. And the challenge here, I think, is that these are often not very interesting or important cybersecurity incidents. The cybersecurity incidents in which nobody has been affected and there's no potential information that anybody could be upset about getting out. And so you sort of put yourself in a corner where the only incidents you're really kind of learning from in depth are the ones that are perhaps not most pressing or most representative of the landscape. And part of what we see sort of shifting this sense of when you write a report and how dangerous it is to write a report comes from a legal ruling in 2020 about a Capital One data breach that happened the previous year in 2019. Capital One hires a fancy law firm, Debevoise and Plimpton, to come in and oversee their breach. Their lawyers do everything you're supposed to do, according to the lawyers we talked to, right? They hire a new firm, Mandiant. They have some trouble, though, because Mandiant, another arm of Mandiant, has already been doing some security work for Capital One prior to this. They use the tripartite agreement, and they are on all of the calls with all of the investigators and all of that. Mandiant writes a final report about this breach of about 100 million customers' personal information. They give a total timeline of everything that happens. They have an analysis of sort of where Capital One's lines of defense and security controls failed, how extensive the compromise was, what remediation steps the company should take moving forward. They do the Mandiant thing, right? The sort of, we've done a really deep dive, we've tried to extract everything we can. That report is sent first to the lawyers to really make clear this is all about legal advice. The law firm then decides, okay, we're going to share it with a very select group of people within Capital One, the legal department, the board of directors, and a few technical employees. Then Capital One gets sued, and the plaintiffs want the report. Of course they want the report. And they go to court, and Capital One and their lawyers say, no, this is protected by work product doctrine. This was a report that was created in anticipation of litigation exactly like this. And the court says, no. We don't buy that at all. And the reason they give is, in the court's view, the driving force for writing this report included business considerations, not just legal considerations. They said Capital One failed to show that the report would not have been created in essentially the same form in the absence of litigation. There's an even more kind of, to me, absurd way of trying to combat this, which is what Target does after its breach, in which you say, we're actually going to get 2 incident reports. One for business purposes and one for legal purposes, and you hire 2 separate firms to oversee those. That falls out of vogue, or I don't know if it falls out of vogue or it's just really expensive and a huge nuisance. So by the time you get to Capital One, most firms aren't doing that anymore. They're just saying we have one report and it's just for legal purposes. And one of the things about that ruling that definitely makes a pretty strong impression on the lawyers we talked to is part of the rationale is you've given this report to some technical employees. Right, not just to the legal department, which has to be ready for litigation, but also to like all of these people who work in IT so that they can implement the recommendations. Of course, right? What's the point in just giving the technical report to the lawyers? But because Capital One has done that, then the court feels, well, this isn't just about legal considerations. This is also about business considerations. The other thing that comes up is that Mandiant had this retainer agreement in place, right? So because it's a very popular sought after security company, in order to ensure that in the event of a breach, they would have access to Mandiant services, Capital One had signed a prior agreement retaining them. And then when they exercised that agreement, court says, well, but you'd already sort of set up this agreement beforehand. So it seems like it's not just about anticipating this class action lawsuit. It seems like it's something kind of more about anticipating broader business concerns related to cybersecurity. And this is a real blow to the people in the kinds of law firms that we're talking to for this project, to find out that, even if you do everything exactly by the book, you're still not necessarily going to be able to protect these incident investigation reports. We talked to a bunch of people who just said, like, that's it, no more reports after Capital One. I mean, we're very critical of this decision. This is one lawyer who says the courts have jumped the fence, no longer respect privilege on the report, therefore we're not creating the report. Since Capital One, I've not received a report, 0, because I tell them not to. The trajectory of the law is doing a disservice to cybersecurity. And another one, I've started to advise against written reports. It was not our practice before Capital One. I'd say 75% of the time before Capital One, we had written reports. Now in 75% plus, we do not. Now, one of the things that I sometimes get in trouble with when I present this work is the title, How Lawyers Undermine Cybersecurity. And I think one of the reasons that lawyers object to that is their feeling of, it's not us, it's the courts who are undermining cybersecurity, who are sort of putting us in this position.
They're lawyers too.
They're lawyers too, fair. And in fact, when we published this as an article, we changed it to how privilege undermines cybersecurity, because we thought that might be a little less volatile, but it also led to a lot of misunderstandings about what the paper was about. And people thought it was about, like, oh, white privilege and cybersecurity. So I would say it's hard to win on the title front and really do it in a way that makes everybody happy. But there's definitely a clear sense when we're doing these interviews, fewer and fewer reports than ever before. If we can't protect them, we're just not going to write them. And when we do see these reports, we also see some, what I would call sort of fairly severe micromanagement of what's allowed to be in them. Here's a lawyer who says, we'll give instructions as to what we want to see in the report and what we don't want to see in there. We try to give guidelines like no adjectives, no adverbs. Here's another attorney. I try to avoid gratuitous language, like these are the best practices in information security. Here's a forensic investigator. These are the people who are responsible for drafting these reports and sending them to the lawyers. One investigation I worked on involved 2 or 3 days going back and forth with lawyers about specific wording in the report, where they didn't want me to say that a specific server was vulnerable, right? And so I think there's this sort of disconnect between a lot of the technical forensics people to whom saying a server is vulnerable is a very specific objective thing, right? Like this server software has not been patched. It's vulnerable to certain kind of exploitation, versus the lawyers who look at that language like, this is gratuitous, right? We don't need to say vulnerable. We don't need to say best practice. We can just say, there was a server here and it was running this software on it. And that, I think, also leads to a certain amount of friction between the attorneys and the technical investigators they're overseeing, and a lot of taking things out of these reports, right? Is saying, look, we're not going to talk about what the industry best practices are because that's going to get us in trouble if we're not doing exactly that. We're not going to use any adjectives because, God forbid, any of those adjectives suggest that what we're doing might not have been absolutely perfect. We're not going to say anything was vulnerable. And you can imagine how you very quickly end up with a report that doesn't have a lot in it, that isn't necessarily going to be super useful. The other thing that they absolutely don't want in reports, and this we heard pretty much from everybody we talked to, are any ideas for what the firm should do differently in the future. So if you think back to the beginning of this talk, which is all about, like, we're going to learn all these great lessons, we're going to improve, we're going to get stronger and stronger every day. This, I think, is pretty directly kind of countering that idea of you make a bunch of changes based on what went wrong last time. And the reason you don't want any recommendations is because then if the firm doesn't make those changes, you've run into a big problem. So here are a couple of attorneys talking about that. A lot of times the incident response providers will say, we've got 9 ideas for remediation. And we'll say, that's great, but don't put those in the report. What we really don't want is a written report that says, do these 9 things, and the client only does 3 of them. And then there's another incident later on that would have been stopped by one of those things they didn't do. Now, I read that quote, and I'm like, well, this seems like a good reason to write down all of the things if you think there's later going to be an incident that might have been stopped by one of them. But in the eyes of the attorneys who are sort of thinking about legal risk, this becomes a huge liability. Here's another attorney: when I become concerned is when the forensics team is producing a paper trail, because then the plaintiff can say your outside expert said you should do this and you didn't, so you were negligent. So I don't want that in writing. And then we get into a bunch of discussions with both the lawyers and the technical experts about, well, does this matter? Right? As I say, my predisposition coming from cybersecurity is this is a big loss. These are all the lessons we most want to be learning. The lawyers sometimes disagree with that, I would say. And their main grounds for disagreeing with it is like, well, all these security firms, they just want to sell you something. And so they're going to put down, you should buy all these things we do. And that's not valuable and that's not tailored to the incident. I think when we talk to the technical forensics people, they have a very different take, right? So the forensics investigators that we talked to, one of them said, IT directors can strategically use forensics reports to win internal resources, but this doesn't happen and can't happen if I just deliver it to counsel. By the time it makes it to the customers, it's probably not doing any good at that point. So part of the rationale here is like, look, if you've been agitating within your organization, I really need the money to buy this new intrusion detection system, and I can't get any support for that. If a big report comes in from outside that says you should really have an intrusion detection system, that's really helpful. You can use that strategically to win those internal resources, but you can't do that if the IT team never sees it, because that's considered a legal liability. The other thing that comes up a lot in talking to the forensics investigators is, especially after a cybersecurity breach, you know what happens to a lot of the IT people? They leave or they're fired, right? It's not historically a great moment to stick around and, you know, be blamed for everything that went wrong. So another investigator we talked to says, for continuity purposes, you can't assume the person you're talking to today is going to be employed tomorrow. And these are long-term plans. And I'm not going to sit there and read IP addresses. If you need to whitelist or blacklist these 7,000 IP addresses, you need that in writing. Right? This is somebody saying it's not that helpful to say, like, you can't write it down, but just get on the phone and tell them what they should do. First of all, the person you're talking to may leave. And second of all, some of this is just really hard to do by phone. Some of this is actually a lot of data, a lot of specifics. Here's an attorney who's, I think, as close as the attorneys we talked to are willing to come to conceding that maybe there are some drawbacks to the way that they've set this up. He says you never want to put in writing what the security system is like, but you also need candor to improve the system. And there is a risk that there won't be as much frank assessment, because that would turn into a roadmap for plaintiffs. Right, so I would say on the whole, the lawyers we talked to are resistant to the idea of this is a huge blow for security, but some of them will concede, yeah, there's a trade-off here between kind of how frank we want to be and how much help we want to give to potential future plaintiffs. I mentioned there's also some impact on pre-breach assessments. I would say that to a lesser extent mirrors some of what you see in reports. And what I basically mean is, if you get a really bad security assessment, often the lawyers will bury it. And they'll say, oh, we don't want this. And their rationale is kind of the same as for those reports. They say, look, everybody who's doing that assessment just wants to sell you something. And so they're going to tell you your security is terrible. You need to buy all of this stuff. And we don't want that sort of anywhere in the records. Here's a lawyer says, pre-breach audits, they're like red, right? By which he means everybody's saying your systems are terrible, everything's a disaster. Arguably, that might be because your systems are terrible and everything's a disaster. But I think lawyers who work in this field sometimes feel it's also a little bit of a sales pitch. You look at the report and it's like a plaintiff's dream. And of course, the security firm is doing it because they want to get more work. But they structure it in this very alarming way to get more work. I had one recently where it was terrible. And I just said to the forensics team, we don't want a final report. Just keep this in draft form. Don't ever send us a report. So a similar model, but instead of a report about something that's actually gone wrong, now we're talking about assessments that are just sort of tell us if there are any holes in our cybersecurity, if there's anything we need to do to improve it. And I think that's also sort of a trend that's interesting to me and worth continuing to monitor. A couple other things I want to highlight quickly. First, there's this really interesting power dynamic I hadn't anticipated between the law firms and the digital forensics firms. And the power dynamic is that because the law firms run the whole investigation, hire the digital forensics firm through that tripartite agreement, they become the primary customer that the forensics firm is trying to satisfy, right? As opposed to the breach firm that they're investigating. Here are some forensics investigators saying essentially that. For me, the breach coach, that's what we sometimes call the lawyers who run these, is the most important client. We say that the counsel is our client and the counsel has their client, that's the breach firm, which we call client's client, right? The people who we're really trying to satisfy are the law firms. We had one breach attorney who runs a firm that does quite a lot of this type of work and therefore controls quite a lot of contracts with digital forensics firms. Say to us, when we say jump, the cybersecurity firms say how high, right? They understand kind of all of their business flows through us, and we have pretty total control over what it is we can tell them to do. Because if we decide we're not working with the security firm anymore, that's thousands of investigations that they've lost, as opposed to this is one incident that I'm investigating for one firm, and if we upset them, fine, right? We still have all of our other business. So I think sort of when I think about who's in control here, why aren't the insurers more in control? Why aren't the technical digital forensics people more in control? There's this sense that kind of the law firms control a lot of business in this space. I want to touch on the downstream impacts, which I also think are interesting and sort of one of the motivations, as I mentioned, for doing this. We talked to a few regulators. We didn't talk to a very large number of regulators for this project, but we were interested in kind of, does this impact them at all and what they're able to learn? And what we heard from them is, we're just kind of bored with this and used to it by now, right? When we are investigating incidents, we'll basically be told we can't send you a report. Maybe we'll send you the executive summary. And this is a regulator who says the executive summary is fine for our purposes. We sort of half-heartedly asked on these calls, and most of the time I don't, is there a report? But it's evolved to a point where most of the time they're not writing a report, and that's a shame. And what we heard from regulators is basically like, there's no point in us asking. Sometimes we might, usually we don't even bother because there won't be a report, or if there's a report, they're not going to be willing to share it with us because they're going to be afraid if we share this more widely, then we're undermining that sort of privilege and work product doctrine defense. And then we talked to insurers as well, who also said, like, we can't get a single thing written down. Sometimes we can get a phone call that the lawyers are on and the forensics people are on, and maybe the breach firm, who's actually our policyholder, is on, and we can ask them some questions about what happened. The insurer says there's so much confusion in this call. It's a game of telephone. The forensic firm tells the breach firm who goes to counsel. It's all confused and jumbled. It's hard to get straight answers to simple questions, right? And this comes back to the question of sort of how much technical expertise do the lawyers have? And I think there's a fairly large range across lawyers who work in this space. How much do they understand about what they're being told by some of the digital forensics incident response people? And also, as that gets relayed through all of these different parties, how much of it sort of makes its way accurately to the insurers and the other people who are on these calls? So I want to wrap up just with sort of quick summary of some of these findings. The first one, which I say, you know, with as little judgment as I can, is just definitely objectively, lawyers take a lot of measures to protect confidentiality in these investigations, and that those measures have been shifted by rulings like Capital One in the past few years, so that they are more extreme, in my view, or at the very least, leading to much less documentation, because there's fear that the other measures are not going to be sufficient to protect that documentation if it's created. That the digital forensics and incident response firms definitely alter their language, their communication patterns, their documentation, according to the preferences of the lawyers who are overseeing these investigations, so that they can be sure they can continue to work on these incidents, to be hired by these law firms, and try to sort of suit their patterns of language to what it is the lawyers want out of them. And I would say the most subjective finding that we offer from this project, and the one that upsets the most lawyers, is this last one. That this then introduces barriers both to how firms are going to be able to learn from security incidents and failures, and also to how the larger community, right? How insurers are going to be able to learn what it is they should require of all their policyholders, how policymakers and regulators are going to learn from incidents and understand what are the requirements that we should be putting in place across industry based on where we see things working, where we see things failing, and that has been a significant obstacle to sort of trying to make progress in learning at scale from the different types of cybersecurity incidents we see. I have a very short slide on, so what do we do about this? Because I don't feel I have great answers. But I think where I come down, having spent a lot of time thinking about this problem, is that there needs to be some combination of stronger confidentiality protections for the really in-depth analysis of what's gone wrong, coupled with more mandatory reporting about some of the technical details, right? What I don't want is a world in which we say every piece of investigation is absolutely top secret and can never be disclosed to anybody, because I don't think that provides good incentives for strong security either. But I think if you sort of think about some of the new reporting initiatives like CERCIA, the new critical infrastructure reporting for Cybersecurity Incidents Act, and you say, okay, if we're going to have more public information mandated about ransomware, about other types of cybersecurity incidents, is there a way that we can couple that increased reporting with also some protection for some of the more internal investigation that's happening? And some of the analogies that we encountered for this are things like the mortality and morbidity assessments in hospitals, right? Where there's an opportunity to go back and kind of say, what went wrong here? That's a little bit separate from the standard liability processes for what happens if doctors get sued in the aftermath of an incident. And I would be interested in sort of trying to understand and explore whether there's some model here that both allows for enough public disclosure of what's happened so that plaintiffs can file class action lawsuits if that's an appropriate thing to do, can learn some of the technical details about what's happened, but also so that firms can do some pretty significant self-critique and understand what is it that we need to do moving forward, and even feel confident enough to write that down and share it with some of their IT staff and actually try to carry some of those lessons forward. I'm going to stop there. I'd be delighted to take questions, or if lawyers want to challenge me on the title or anything else, we'll do that. Thank you all so much.
Well, I'm just a law student, not a lawyer, but I love the title, so. I kind of have two questions. The first one is, you've got to speak to so many people in the industry. Do you think there's more concern among these attorneys and their clients about regulatory enforcement, or about plaintiffs having paths to suing them, or is it kind of like a split situation?
I think there's more concern about class action lawsuits. I do think there's some growing concern around regulation. I think it's pretty specific to certain regulatory bodies. The one that came up the most was actually the New York Department of Financial Services, where a number of the law firms we talked to said, you know, they're always breathing down our necks. And so I think there are specific regulators and regulatory agencies where there's concern, not so much about how much it's going to cost, right? I think the penalties are generally much smaller, but there's concern about sort of how much visibility those regulators want. Are they going to run their own investigations if we don't give them evidence that we've provided enough of sort of thorough process on our end? And I think the other place where you see some concern about regulation is also Europe. So some of the lawyers we talked to, most of them practice pretty exclusively in the United States. Some of them also do some work with sort of more international firms who have worked on incidents where they said, look, you know, it's all very well to say to a US regulatory agency, no, there's no report, but you bring that to a European data protection authority and they're going to be furious. So I think there are other settings where there's a sense of, we have much more to fear from the regulators than from the class action lawsuits. And we need to be a little bit more attentive to sort of how we make sure they feel we've done our due diligence in investigating these incidents as well. Yeah.
So this is not the first time I've read the paper or heard the talk, and every time I learn something new. And so this has been great. I have two thoughts. One is, the more I thought about this problem, the more I'm thinking maybe the solution should come from education departments. Maybe the solution is about learning. How do we learn things? And what I would argue is that there is, I separate between the downstream and so the internal and the external. On the internal learning side, the fact that we have a 100-page report that would sit there brain dusting and old is not necessarily going to mean that anyone will learn anything. And having worked with some organization like that, would have been on the writing side of other reports, not anything like this. I know that they don't get read all the time. And so there's an immediate assumption there, the documentation in turn means learn. And I want to push back on that. And maybe the solution is therefore that we need to think about, how do people learn? How do CEOs learn? How do IT departments? Now, the different, more creative ways to teach that come not in these ways. So that's the kind of one thought that came to me. The other thing I'm curious about is a different marketplace where there is an incentive structure to create reporting. That's compliance. I mean, in that space, if you want to be compliant, therefore to get new contracts because you're compliant with standard tech, you need to have a report that you're compliant. I'd be curious to hear if you thought about like those spaces as compared to the incident investigation spaces.
So this is a little bit the risk of being a professor of cybersecurity policy, but in my mind, the answer to your first question is kind of the answer to your second question, or is your second question, which is, if there was stronger cybersecurity regulation that said, look, here are the things you have to do, then yes, there would be absolutely that incentive to have a compliance report that says, you know, here we do this, and we do that, and we do that. And I think one of the reasons we don't see a ton of focus on compliance in this particular piece of the world is because by and large in most sectors, you don't have that kind of regulation. And here again, I think there are some interesting differences between the US and the EU and other places. But sort of the question of how do you learn, which I think is a great one. I think I've been mostly thinking of as like, well, you, the breached firm, probably don't learn, but your insurer learns or your regulator learns. And then they come back when you renew your insurance policy and they say, by the way, in order to renew this insurance policy, you have to do X, Y, and Z.
So I'll say one more word
Yeah,
on downstream, because on the downstream, I actually think that for that, we don't need a 100-page detailed report. We need aggregate data that is produced in ways that might be less challenging to the things that you highlight.
Yeah, I think that's say the hope of CERCIA, right? Is, you know, could we put together an IRF, an incident reporting form where you would be able to do that in a way that the Department of Homeland Security or whoever else could kind of digest and analyze and provide those analytics in a useful way. I'm hopeful, but I'm also a little skeptical, right? I've seen a lot of iterations of cybersecurity reporting policy. I think we'll see as CERCIA kind of gets pushed out, how well that goes. I mean, just to detour for 1 second, my biggest fear is just the length of that form, right? That sort of, if you ask people for 100 different things, then you're probably not going to get very many of them, and you're going to end up with a lot of gaps in your data. And I think the Department of Homeland Security, in my view, has really struggled with figuring out, like, how many questions do we absolutely need? Because once you circulate it across the whole government, everybody's got 10 things they'd like to add to it. So I think the IRF is still a work in progress. I also just really like saying IRF. But yes, I think that's absolutely fair to say. You know, the long report is not the ideal template.
Can I just jump in? Push back a little bit on that. I think these long reports, if they have detailed causal analysis that goes back from what went wrong to some sort of analysis of what actually might have prevented it, because a lot of people talk about control failures. Most of the time it's not a control failure, the control wasn't there at all, right? So I do think that's a place where the insurance companies, if they really want to know, would get value from those detailed analyses, because I doubt they have their own people on staff who can really do that and start to flow back away from things went boom and went crazy to what should the world have looked like before that would have prevented that. But I have a totally separate question. You described a sequence on one of your slides of communication that I've seen in recent years and has always seemed absolutely bonkers to me, where an incident happens and then somebody who owns an insurance policy contacts the insurer, and then the insurer okay, now it's time to pick an IR firm and a law firm from your panel. That's just nuts to me. It seems like you should have those people all picked out and ready to roll way ahead of time. Is this Capital One ruling, is that what has driven that the court held it against Capital One, that they already had a relationship with Mandiant? Like, or is it there's so much demand for this that they have to hotel people to different firms while there's already an incident going on? Does my question make sense?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think it's more complicated than just Capital One, because to be honest, it predates Capital One.
Okay.
A lot of this, I mean, Capital One changes some things, but it doesn't totally change that structure.
Yeah.
I think a couple things play into that. One is this is smaller business when cyber insurance starts. So it's not something where even if you already have a law firm, presumably, if you're a business, but your law firm doesn't necessarily have a data security and privacy practice. So the insurers start building out these panels of like law firms that specifically do this work. And the idea is you want somebody who's, specifically a breach coach to oversee this process. And then even as more of the large firms start building out those, we run into a dynamic I didn't talk about in this presentation, which I also think is fun to interview lawyers about, which is how much is your insurer willing to pay your lawyers per hour to do this work? So you end up in this situation where you'll have a company say, look, we've already got a law firm we use. And their insurer will say, that law firm is way too expensive. We're not going to pay their hourly rate. We'll pay the hourly rate of these guys.
So like a finer point on this though, years ago, I was reviewing policies and they would have the panel and they would say, one of the first things you need to do when you buy this policy is go pick out your firms. And it seems like it shifted to once you have an incident and everything's on fire, call us and we'll help you get set up. And that's the change that I just don't understand.
I think some of that has also been driven by the big breach mills. This is also a term they really hate, right? The companies that kind of set up their whole law practice to be like, we do 100,000, 50,000 breaches every year, right? They are really interested in the idea that sort of, we're not going to be everybody's law firm for everything. We just do this one very specific thing. But as soon as they have something go wrong, we want them referred to us. And they compete on that in a variety of different ways. A big one is price, obviously, and sort of how much they charge per hour. But some of it is also this kind of like, we can do this really fast because it's the only thing we do, right? We can handle your breach in 100 hours. And so I think sort of there's just a process that's set up, and it's set up, as I say, largely in the days when breaches of personal data are kind of the main concern. And then because all of these different types of risk are captured under the same standalone cyber insurance policies, it kind of bleeds over into ransomware and everything else as those become larger risks. I don't disagree with you that it's a, bad way to choose your law firm. I do think when it comes to having your security firm already on retainer, the Capital One case does have an influence on that.
That sucks.
Right. And the sort of like, well, you had this business relationship. It wasn't just anticipating legal advice.
For sure.
And I think the digital forensics and IR firms totally agree with you, right? They say like, we need to have these agreements. Otherwise we can't plan our business at all. But now we're being told that makes it harder for us to do everything. Another piece of this project was trying to understand, is it worse if you have to bring in a brand new firm that's never seen your computer systems before to do all the incident response, to which all of the DFIR people were like, yeah, of course that's worse, right? It's much better if we have some sense of sort of how your systems are set up.
Just to comment on Craig's thought, maybe a practical consideration is that in general, law firms and insurance firms last a lot longer than cybersecurity firms do. So it could be pointless to put them in advance into an agreement because by the time you have a breach, they might be gone.
Maybe. I mean, I would say at this point, there are at least a few pretty big, pretty reputable, right? The reason you want Mandiant on retainer is because they're really well known and you think that they're one of the best firms in the business. But I think you're right to say it's a kind of differently structured industry with different ideas. And one of the ways in which it's differently structured now is a lot of the sort of new players in this space view the insurance panels as a way to drive business for them. Yeah. Right. And so their idea of sort of Mandiant's model was not that. Mandiant's model was like, we're going to publish this really big public report on Chinese cyber espionage and become a household name. But a lot of, like when you go to cyber insurance conferences, which I don't recommend, but if you happen to find yourself, right, most of the activity of what's going on are new or smaller cybersecurity firms kind of buttering up insurers to say, we've got this amazing new thing, you should really put us on your panel. And so I think there's a way in which kind of players in the industry have tried to take advantage of the structure in such a way that they try to play by the terms of the law firms and the insurance firms.
So many implications of all this, including like the sophisticated clients is one thing, right? But the small, medium-sized businesses, the nonprofits.
Absolutely.
Is there a push to like bring in CrowdStrike or the equivalent of under some of these mega law firms, right? I mean, there's a lot that I would love to talk with you more about, but we're out of time. So how about for now, let's join us in thanking Josephine for the terrific conversation. In my mind, this is like a perfect mix for the speaker series, right? There's a legal aspects, the technical aspects, the business aspects. So this was just wonderful. So if you're willing, maybe stay up, we can take some more individual questions.
People have other questions. Thank you all again.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody. Fascinating. So cool. I have one quick question for you.
Yeah.
Are you involved with this NSF IU?
Yeah.
Yeah, are you doing one of them?
Yeah.
Okay, cool, that's cool. Yeah,
If we
I was,
do it to ours, no.
I know, right? No, this is what I'm wondering is like, I should have reached out to you earlier.
I'm
because
trying
we're-
for what our stupid acronym is. ARMA, ARMA, the
We're
Center
starting.
of-
That's okay. No, that's okay, yeah.
Sorry, I was trying to bring-
No, it's fine, yeah, we're doing with insurance information. Then that came with the team from MIT, that's cyber risk. So like, it's a, yeah, so that was a,
Okay.
would have been cool, but I
Yeah,
understand.
all right,
Totally
I-
get it. Let's see how things work out with the free proposal.
Oh, sorry, what page are you on?
Let's touch base at some point.
Oh.
Whatever you end up doing, we'll keep it.
Well, no, I mean, it's kind of, yeah, I can see tons of overlap. Yeah. Well, good luck with it. That's great, yeah.
Yeah, they're very easy. Scott, how are you?
Yeah, good. Were you at the breakfast? Okay, good. Excellent, good thing. Oh, good. Good. That's great. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, unfortunately, it's a quick trip.
Best practice, which
We'll make sure, yeah.
Great, thank you.
That's right. Good to see you, Greg. That was great. It's nerdy, but it's like. Right? Yeah. Maybe the vendor. So great. Good. How are you?
Thanks for the.
So. Of course.
putting this
No,
on.
thanks for coming. This is great. Good collaboration. Thank you for coming. How are you, man? Doing well? Good to see you. Yeah. Yes, I feel like I've recognized you. So, yeah.
One of the joint degree students.
I mean, I've heard that it's a picture of you. But yeah, it's great to see you. How are you? You guys all right? Yeah. Fair. Yeah, you're working as well. No, okay, good. Taking some time to properly, okay.
Yeah, I'm all for sure also.
Yeah, okay.
That's not a good.
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. Yeah.
Actually, wanted to ask you about chemistry.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I saw one of the.
Oh.
Guess that.
That might be for the masters, are you thinking of? Yeah. So you don't need that for the capstone class. You can sign up for the capstone class even if you only just take them whatever. One or two basics. So we have something to build on. So no, I think it's B655 here at Mal, or it's 565. So feel free. We haven't nailed down all the clients for the screen. It's probably going to be McKinsey, probably going to be Fidelity, maybe Humana's Clear, maybe I am, which is like the federal CISOs for a lot of federal agencies kind of collaborate in this support group. So we do some projects for them too. So anyway, really fun. It's always interesting.
Well, I guess I have to call first year.
Sure.
You know,
Oh, it'll be fun. Yeah.
if you have questions.
Yeah.
Fine. I'm already signed up for 15 credits. Right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I don't know if
Yeah.
capstone would kind
I agree. I mean, there are, I'll say this, it's a little bit more of a group project kind of class, right? So, you know, there we give you a menu of options, you guys kind of self-select, so there's usually actually, depending on the final numbers, like 5 or so students per team. So, I mean, a lot of the heavy lifting is gonna be team focus, and we have the contract up front, so hopefully there's no surprises, so you kind of know what's doing. There are just a few individual things. There's like a National Security Council simulation. It's a little more individual, but it's pretty quick, like 2-3 pages. And then there is a data breach kind of investigation. We do kind of a mock presentation to the board of directors for the company's Charles River Associates. So they always kind of do the write-up for us. And like, it makes it a little more fun because it kind of builds from their clients that they work with. So those are the main heavy lift things. So I mean, I wouldn't say it's a crazy amount of extra work, and you can kind of rent it out, especially the final deliverable, that main client project. So you can find times that are less busy in the term, so, but I mean, it won't be the last time we offer it either, right? So you could always do it, you know, the following spring.
Yeah.
If you're ready to, so.
And then my last question about that is, I'm currently signed up for, there's a data cards practicum here.
Right.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, schools, 2 parts of it.
That'd be great.
It has the exact same numbers that are.
Yeah, it's 655, but that's just kind of the standalone practicum number.
And the system, you know, I'm enrolled in everything else. but
Oh, yeah.
the system doesn't allow.
Oh, you can't- oh, really? Oh, that's funny.
It just like blocked. So I don't know if it would be
Yeah, it's a good
a
question.
bad idea to do both at the same time. Or if there's some kind of work.
In my mind, the more practical, the better. I mean, that's actually applied fun stuff, right? I would imagine this is gonna be a good question for like the malware registrar, like, or like Alexa or somebody that can help us navigate how to get you into both. I'm sure it's just some system place that won't allow you to register for 2 with the same title. So they're different classes, so there should be a way around it. And like I said, there's different sections of my class all across campus. The downside of registering directly for one of those is the way like the fees get charged to law students who have the umbrella, which is why we have the 655 class to begin with. So yeah, you might think her. Feel free to CC me. We can try to figure out something. Joelle would probably know too, and who more. Yeah. So no doubt we can get it worked out if you want to do it. So yeah, sure. Great. Glad you're able to participate in this. I'm gonna see if I need any help outside, and I'll come back and then help with Joseph.
Oh,
Yeah.
how are you? Hello, doctor.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I'm a law student here,
Fantastic.
and I'm also part of the, I don't know if you know this, the school offers a joint degree. I'm also a master's in cybersecurity and risk management,
That's awesome.
which is a lot of fun. And I was wondering if in your research, there's any data on repeat offenders, meaning do the same firms that get breached, are they the same ones that get breached over and over, or is it always like a one-time?
There definitely are repeat incidents. I would say, you know, it's something the insurers think a lot about because every time you get breached, your insurance premiums go up. And so there's a lot more scrutiny on a firm the second time it gets breached from its insurer. And I think it becomes harder to say over and over again, oh, we haven't done any investigation, we haven't done any report. But I would say there aren't kind of concrete, to my knowledge, different standards for the repeat, right? Like it's, your premium definitely increases, but it's not clear that there's well, now you must write a report or anything like that. But there's a huge number of repeat offenders in the insurer's data sets.
I was wondering if you explored how that provides an incentive for this whole system that you identified, where what incentive does a law firm have to help their client get better if they only make money from the breaches?
So I think that's a real risk. And I think the other risk is sort of exactly what one of the quotes I read was about, which is if you think there's a decent likelihood there is going to be an event, you definitely don't want anything in writing about how we could have prevented it. And so I think it's this sort of counterproductive, you know, we know there are a lot of repeated issues. We don't want anybody in the event of a second or a third to go back and say, hey, you actually had a report after the first incident that told you do X, Y, or Z. So I do think it sort of plays into it in less productive ways than you might expect.
And then my last question is kind of as a solution to that. Has there been any talk about a forensic, like a forensic?
So I
team
think
having-
that would be a really good idea to sort of have some specific privilege where you didn't need lawyers in the room.
Yeah,
charging
it's
a lot
literally
of money.
the technical, the forensic.
I
team
think that
provides-
hasn't been something we've seen in a lot of policy circles, but I think it's a great proposal.
Okay.
Like it would be, to my mind, a very advantageous structure.
Okay, cool. Well, enjoy Bloomington.
Thank you.
Have
Great
fun.
to meet you.
Great to meet you too. Thank you.
Take care. Hi.
Welcome. I would say somebody who actually booked a cybersecurity minute, directly gets with the lawyers or to report or anything like that.
Interesting.
Yeah, I like, well, what if, how does that come, if I, here's the point I think of. And it's like, what times are you gonna learn from this? Right, the fact, it's my guess.
I think that's probably right. No, it's an interesting dynamic, but not one. Certainly one that surprised me to this topic.
See you later.
Great to meet you.
Hey, great to see you. Well, Josephine, thank you.
My great pleasure. Thank you for bringing me out. I feel like I basically invited myself.
Are you
I used
kidding?
So many times. I was like, I've never been to Indiana.
The door is wide open and hopefully we can get you for a longer and
That would be
some other
great.
fun stuff. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. Yeah, you're doing okay otherwise? Life is
Yeah,
in progress?
week, but you
Very
know,
good.
good to stay
My
busy.
4 older daughters were up with us. And they're
How
just
old are
like-
your?
They're 12 and 10. It's like, oh, this is good. We had like a letter, they wrote this lovely letter to. Hey Harris in the mailbox, and it's just like. It's tough. It's tough all over, but when you see it through their eyes, it's like my second was just. What can you say? It's like, it's going to be okay. I hope. I hope. I don't know. I think it really will be for a while. So yeah.
It requires.
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
I don't know, did you teach this week? Or you
Um,
this semester?
Honestly, not much. Yeah, there was one co-taught.
I taught
situation.
yesterday morning.
Yeah, oh my god, right,
It just feels like,
right?
I don't know if it feels as much this way here, if there's more of a mixed sense of where the student body's at, but in Boston, it feels pretty uniform,
Oh,
pretty
yeah.
dismal, so.
Right? I remember right after 2016, I was still at Belferson on sabbatical, and it was just like. Everybody was all set to like the bus was gonna arrive, everybody was like going to DC basically, right? And then it's like, or. And we buggered off to Maine, up to Katie, and just like, I
Good
forget it,
choice.
yeah.
I think
Yeah.
for me, and I don't know if this is the right approach, but
Oh, yeah.
in the short term, I think to sort of do some things that keep me busy and distracted, like come here,
Oh,
just sort of
Yeah.
not sit at home on my computer.
Well, I think that's it. I think that's helpful. I think that's helpful.
So thank you for bringing me out.
No, are you kidding?
Not that was my plan.
At least it's to change your pace, yeah. Yeah,
Change of
exactly.
pace, it's good to be someplace new, it's great to see your program, what an amazing
Yeah.
thing. So
Yeah, well, it's fun stuff, and as you know, there's a lot of cool people to work with, so
I
yeah.
love that you guys have umbrellas.
Yeah.
So it's like the most useful thing anybody's ever did. I did get
Yeah.
an umbrella.
For sure, right?
I
Yeah.
always need more of those.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's so good to see you. Well, will we cross paths at some point? I'm trying to think what we have to.
Yeah.
Is there?
I'm gonna try to do the April like cyber law and policy
Oh,
scholars
God,
thing.
Ohio.
That could be fun.
Brilliant. And if you ever want to come out to Boston.
Oh, hey,
we
yeah,
always
yeah,
host you very happily.
Very fun. No, very fun.
I know you also have
Be great.
family and a
Yeah.
million other obligations.
Oh, no, it's all good. That'd be fun. That'd be fun too. Yeah. You mind if we get a little selfie for the website?
Oh,
Should
please.
we do it?
That would be my great pleasure.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Got this. Awesome. Excellent.
It's got such a pleasure.
Josephine.
I needed this week.
I hope it's, yeah, as you can tell, there's a, and regardless of that NSF thing, I would love to find ways to work things
Have
out.
that. So I was, who am I doing that with? Tyler Moore and Alberto Dinanti at
Okay.
Georgia Tech.
Oh, okay.
People
Interesting.
who
Okay,
I've been
cool.
working on this with.
Sure, oh,
I
absolutely.
think they were being very candid.
Oh,
There
yeah.
are strengths and some weaknesses.
Oh, hey,
Um,
as with, yeah.
And I
Yeah,
have
yeah.
not been spearheading it.
Oh, sure.
because
I hear you.
have a
I hear you,
a
yeah.
deep-seated wariness of all multi-institution, multi-year, multi-everything.
Full kettle of fish, man. I hear you.
But
I
if
hear
there
you.
was, if there was some small capacity in which I could like work on
Yes.
paper with you and help.
Oh, exactly. Well, I'm just wondering, like, just even one of those 5 research projects, I mean, we could just envision like working with Asif and Craig, who you heard from, and like finding some cool